An unyielding sun beat down on the dusty plains of redemption, a town clinging to the edge of nowhere. For 19-year-old Isabella Montoya, it was her wedding day and her funeral. Sold by her father to settle a gambling debt, she was to be shackled to a man whose soul was as barren as the land around them. But as the preacher's words droned on, sealing her fate, the chapel doors burst open. A warrior, bloodied but not broken, an Apache with eyes like burning coals, staggered in. He pointed a trembling hand at the groom and uttered 2 words that would ignite a firestorm of vengeance and forbidden love: blood claim. The dust of the Chihuahuan desert settled on everything in the town of Redemption, a fine red powder that clung to sweat-slicked skin and found its way into the deepest corners of every soul. For Isabella Montoya, that dust felt like a shroud. At 19, her world, once vibrant with the colors of desert wildflowers and the warmth of a loving mother's memory, had shrunk to the suffocating confines of the town's small, sun-bleached chapel. Today was her wedding day. It was not a day of celebration, but of transaction. Her father, a man named Ricardo Montoya, a name that once commanded respect among the ranchers and merchants of the territory, had gambled away their last vestiges of prosperity. His final desperate wager was his own daughter. Isabella was the price to settle a debt with a man whose name was a venomous whisper on the wind: Bartholomew Bart Thorne. Thorne was a man carved from the very rock of the harsh landscape. His wealth was as vast as his conscience was barren. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the county, the saloon, the general store, and now he would own Isabella. He was a man well past his prime, with a face like a crumpled map of his own cruelties and eyes the color of a faded dollar bill. He had buried 2 wives already, and the whispers in town said neither had died of natural causes. Isabella stood before the cracked mirror in the small room behind the chapel, her hands trembling as she smoothed down the stiff fabric of the borrowed wedding dress. It was a stark white, a cruel mockery of the purity she was supposed to embody. Her reflection was a stranger's, a pale, wide-eyed girl with her raven-black hair, usually worn in a wild braid now pinned into an elaborate and uncomfortable coif. Her mother's silver cross, her only remaining treasure, felt cold against her skin. "You are a Montoya." Ricardo had slurred at her that morning, his breath thick with the sour stench of cheap whiskey. "You will do your duty." Duty. The word was a lead weight in her stomach. Her duty was to chain herself to a monster to pay for her father's weakness. She had pleaded, begged, and raged, but her defiance had only earned her a stinging slap and the cold finality of a locked door. From her small window, she could see the town gathering. The townsfolk, a mix of weary ranchers, opportunistic merchants, and tired-eyed women, filed into the chapel. Their faces were a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They knew the story. They had seen Ricardo's descent, had heard Thorne's booming laughter echo from the saloon as he sealed the devil's bargain. Yet none would intervene. In Redemption, survival meant minding one's own business. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. It was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval. "It is time, child," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Mr. Thorne does not like to be kept waiting." Isabella took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of dust and her own despair. As she walked from the small room, each step felt like a march to the gallows. The chapel was suffocatingly hot, packed with the bodies of onlookers. The air was heavy with the scent of cheap perfume sweat and the cloying sweetness of the wilting desert blooms that decorated the altar. At the front stood Thorn, resplendent in a tailored black suit that did little to hide his paunch or the cruel set of his mouth. He turned as she approached, his gaze crawling over her like a carrion beetle, a possessive glint in his eyes that made her skin crawl. He took her hand, his own thick and calloused, his grip a vice. The preacher. Reverend Michael, a man whose piety was as thin as his frame, began the ceremony. His voice was a monotonous drone, the familiar words of the holy rites rendered meaningless in this unholy union. We are gathered here today, in the sight of God, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Isabella's gaze drifted past Thorn's shoulder, through the open chapel doors, to the endless, unforgiving expanse of the desert beyond. It was a land she had once loved, a place of freedom and wild beauty. Now it was just a larger version of her cage. She thought of running, of screaming, of fighting. But the sight of her father in the front pew, his face a mask of shame and fear, and the two brutish ranch hands Thorn had positioned by the door, their hands resting on the butts of their colts, snuffed out that fleeting spark of rebellion. Do you, Bartholomew Thorn, take this woman, Isabella Montoya, to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Thorn boomed, his voice echoing in the silent chapel, sealing the first half of her doom. The preacher turned to her. His eyes, small and shifty, avoided hers. And do you, Isabella Montoya? The world around her began to recede. The faces of the crowd blurred into a formless, judgmental mass. The preacher's voice became a distant hum. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the fine layer of dust on her cheek. This was it. The end of her life, the beginning of her servitude. She opened her mouth to speak, the words that would condemn her, the lie that would become her truth. But the words never came. A sudden violent crash shattered the solemnity of the moment. The chapel doors, ripped from their leather hinges, flew inward, slamming against the adobe walls. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Framed in the blinding sunlight of the doorway stood a figure from a nightmare. He was a man, but he looked more like an avenging spirit. He was Apache, his long black hair matted with blood and dirt, his bare chest and arms slick with a gruesome mixture of sweat and gore. A deep, ragged gash ran from his temple down his cheek, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. In his right hand, he clutched a bloody knife. He was wounded, grievously so, but his eyes were alive, burning with a fierce, untamed fire that seemed to scorch the very air in the chapel. He took a staggering step forward, then another, leaving a trail of blood on the dusty floorboards. The crowd shrank back, a wave of fear parting before him. Thorn, his face contorted in a mask of rage and surprise, pushed Isabella behind him. "What in the hell is this? Get him out of here!" he roared at his men. The two ranch hands, recovering from their shock, drew their pistols. But the Apache warrior seemed not to notice them. His burning gaze was fixed not on the terrified crowd or the armed men, but on Bartholomew Thorn. He raised his right hand, the bloody knife pointing not as a weapon, but as an indictment. His voice, though weakened by injury, was rough and clear. Each word a stone cast into the silent pool of the chapel. "Bartholomew Thorn." He called out, his voice a guttural rasp. He took another pained step. "The spirits of the mountain cry out for justice. My brother's blood soaks the ground you stole." He paused, gathering his strength, his chest heaving. Then he uttered the words that would change everything. The words that would shatter Isabella's fate and ignite a firestorm of violence and vengeance that would consume them all. He pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger directly at Thorn. "Blood claim," he declared, his voice echoing in the sudden, deathly silence. "I claim the right of vengeance. I claim your life." The words blood claim hung in the thick, dusty air of the chapel, heavy and ominous as a thunderhead. The term was foreign to most of the townsfolk, but its meaning was unmistakable, carried on the raw, guttural power of the Apache's voice. It was a declaration of war, a promise of death. For a moment, redemption was frozen. The preacher stood with his mouth agape, his Bible slipping from his nerveless fingers. The congregation was a sea of pale, frightened faces. Isabella, standing behind the bulk of Thorn, felt a jolt not of fear, but of something else, a strange, electrifying surge of hope. The spell was broken by Thorn's incredulous, barking laugh. "Blood claim, you filthy savage. You've got no claim on anything but a shallow grave." He turned to his men, his face purple with rage. "I told you to shoot him. What are you waiting for?" The two ranch hands, a burly man named Jed and a younger, nervous-looking fellow named Caleb, finally reacted. They raised their Colts, the twin clicks of the hammers being cocked, echoing like gunshots in the tense silence. But the Apache was faster. With a speed that belied his grievous injuries, he lunged forward, not at Thorn, but to the side. He seized a heavy wooden collection plate from a nearby table and hurled it at Jed. The plate, thick and oaken, caught the larger man squarely in the face with a sickening crunch. Jed staggered back, his nose erupting in a fountain of blood, his pistol firing harmlessly into the ceiling. Caleb, startled, hesitated for a fatal second. The Apache was on him in an instant, a whirlwind of desperate, deadly motion. He slammed Caleb's gun hand against the wall, the pistol clattering to the floor. Before the young ranch hand could cry out, the warrior's bloody knife was at his throat. "No!" Isabella screamed, the sound tearing from her own throat, raw and involuntary. The Apache's burning eyes flickered to her for the briefest of moments. In their dark depths, she saw not just rage, but a profound, soul-deep pain. He held Caleb as a shield, his wounded body pressed against the younger man's back. The knife a terrifying promise. "My name is Dasan," he said, his voice a low growl, his gaze now locked back on Thorn. "You remember my brother Taza? You and your men shot him down like a dog. For what? For a handful of rocks you thought were gold." Thorn's face, which had been a mask of fury, now showed a flicker of something else, recognition, and perhaps a sliver of fear. "He was on my land," Thorn spat his voice, losing some of its bluster. "He was a thief." "He was hunting," Dasan retorted, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "On land that was his, long before you ever drew breath. You murdered him. Now the debt must be paid. A life for a life." The standoff was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The townsfolk, trapped between the enraged cattle baron and the wounded warrior, began to panic. A woman screamed, and a frantic scramble for the exits began creating a chaotic bottleneck at the back of the chapel. Ricardo Montoya, Isabella's father, finally found his voice, a pathetic, pleading whine. "Please, there's been a mistake. We don't want any trouble." Dasan ignored him completely. His focus was absolute. "Thorn, you will face me, or this one dies." He pressed the knife a fraction closer to Caleb's throat, and a thin line of red appeared on the young man's skin. Thorn was trapped. His authority, his very dominance in this town, was being challenged by a single, half-dead Apache. To back down was unthinkable. To fight was to risk the life of one of his own men, and perhaps his own. He was a man who valued his own skin above all else. He looked at the terrified face of his young ranch hand, then at the unwavering, hate-filled eyes of Dasan. And then his gaze fell on Isabella. An idea cruel and cunning began to form in his twisted mind. He saw a way out, a way to turn this disaster to his advantage, to reassert his power and humiliate his enemy in a single stroke. "All right," Thorn said, raising his hands in a gesture of false conciliation. "All right, let the boy go. We can talk about this." Dasan's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "There is no talk. Only blood." "You want a life for a life," Thorn said, his voice becoming smooth, persuasive. "An eye for an eye. That's your law, isn't it? But you're in no shape to fight me, are you? You're bleeding out. You'll be dead before the sun sets." It was true. A dark, spreading stain was growing on Dasan's side, and his breaths were becoming more ragged. The fire in his eyes was still there, but the body that housed it was failing. "So," Thorn continued, a sly, predatory grin spreading across his face, "I'll offer you a different kind of bargain, a different kind of claim." He reached out and yanked Isabella from behind him, shoving her forward. She stumbled, catching herself just inches from the tip of Dasan's bloody knife. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she found herself caught between two terrifying forces. "Here," Thorn announced to the stunned chapel. "You claim a life. Here is a life. Take her instead." A collective gasp of horror rippled through the remaining townsfolk. Even Ricardo, in his drunken stupor, looked shocked. "Bartholomew, no. You can't. I can." Thorn snarled, his eyes gleaming with a perverse triumph. "She is my property. I paid for her fair and square. Her life is mine to give." He turned his cruel gaze back to Dasan. "Take her. Take my bride. Let her be your payment. Take her back to your filthy camp, and do with her what you will. In return, you renounce your blood claim on me. You leave my town, my land, and you never return." It was a devil's bargain, a masterpiece of cruelty. Thorn would not only save his own life, but would rid himself of a potentially troublesome Apache threat. He would also turn his unwilling bride into a sacrificial lamb, a public demonstration of his absolute power. He would be seen not as a coward, but as a cunning strategist who had outsmarted a savage. Isabella stood frozen, her mind reeling. She was being offered up like a piece of meat, her fate tossed between two men who saw her as nothing more than a pawn. She looked from Thorn's leering face to Dasan's. The Apache warrior was staring at her, his expression unreadable. The fire in his eyes was banked now, replaced by a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and something else she couldn't name. He had crashed her wedding to claim the life of her monstrous groom. Now, in a horrifying twist of fate, he was being offered her life instead. "What's it to be savage?" Thorn taunted, his voice dripping with condescension. "A quick death here and now, or a life to take with you. My life, or hers." Dasan's gaze held Isabella's. The knife at Caleb's throat wavered. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. For Isabella, it was a choice between two hells. A slow, suffocating death as Thorn's property, or an unknown, terrifying fate in the hands of the wounded warrior who had come seeking blood. In that terrifying moment, staring into the eyes of the Apache, she didn't know which she feared more. The silence in the chapel was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Every eye was on the wounded Apache Dasan. His choice would determine the fate of everyone in the room. He held the life of Caleb, the young ranch hand, in his hand. But it was Isabella's life that now hung precariously in the balance, offered up in a spectacle of unimaginable cruelty by the man she was supposed to marry. Isabella's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked at Dasan, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a monstrous apparition, but as a man. She saw the lines of pain etched around his eyes, the grim set of his jaw, the tremor of exhaustion that ran through his powerful frame. He was dying. Thorn was right. He was bleeding out his strength, fading with every passing second. His gaze was still locked on hers, and in the dark, fiery depths of his eyes, she saw a flicker of something that stunned her revulsion. It wasn't directed at her, but at Thorn and his monstrous proposition. Dasan had come for honorable vengeance, a blood debt owed for the murder of his brother. Thorn's offer was a defilement of that sacred purpose, a twisted mockery of Apache law. To accept it would be to trade a righteous quest for a tainted prize to become a party to Thorn's own brand of soulless transaction. You would trade a woman's life like she is cattle. Dasan's voice was low-laced with a contempt that was colder than the blade he held. You are without honor. Honor doesn't fill a man's pockets, Thorn sneered, emboldened by Dasan's hesitation. And it won't save you from bleeding to death on this floor. This is your only way out. Take the deal. Take the girl and go. Dasan's eyes moved from Isabella to Thorn, and the fire reignited hotter and more intense than before. My brother's spirit would not rest if I accepted such a coward's bargain. My claim is on your blood, Thorn, not an innocent's. With a sudden, decisive movement, Dasan shoved Caleb forward. The young ranch hand stumbled and fell scrambling away on all fours like a terrified crab. In the same motion, Dasan pivoted, ignoring the searing pain in his side, and hurled his knife. The blade flew through the air, a silver blur. It was not aimed at Thorn's heart, but at his gun hand. Thorn, who had been arrogantly resting his hand on the Colt, holstered at his hip, cried out in a mixture of surprise and agony as the knife's point sank deep into the fleshy part of his hand, pinning it to the worn leather of his gun belt. Thorn shrieked a high, undignified sound that shattered his carefully constructed image of power. He clawed at the knife with his other hand, his face a grotesque mask of pain. The chapel erupted into chaos. Jed, the other ranch hand, finally recovering his senses, lunged for his fallen pistol. But Isabella, acting on pure instinct, moved first. She kicked out her simple leather shoe, connecting with the gun, and sending it skittering across the floor far out of reach. Jed stared at her, his bloody face a picture of disbelief. What the? But he didn't have time to finish. Dasan, using the last of his explosive strength, charged. He crashed into Thorn, a human battering ram. The two men went down in a heap, Thorn's screams of pain mingling with Dasan's guttural roar of effort. Isabella didn't wait to see the outcome. Her brief moment of defiance had broken the spell of her helplessness. A primal, desperate need for freedom surged through her. She saw the open chapel doors, the blinding sunlight, the promise of escape. She ran. She hitched up the cumbersome wedding dress, her feet flying over the dusty floorboards. She didn't look back. She could hear the sounds of struggle, behind her grunts, curses, the thud of bodies hitting the wooden pews. She expected a gunshot, a hand to grab her shoulder, but none came. She burst out of the chapel and into the searing heat of the afternoon sun. The town square was in disarray. People were scattering, shouting, pointing back towards the chapel. She ignored them all. Her eyes fixed on the alleyway between the general store and the blacksmith's forge. It was her only chance. Her lungs burned. Her heart felt like it would explode. But she kept running. The stiff, formal dress was a hindrance, catching on a loose nail, tearing with a loud rip. She didn't care. She stumbled, her ankle twisting, but caught herself on the rough adobe wall of the blacksmith's shop. She risked a glance behind her. Thorne's men were starting to emerge from the chapel, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. Jed was shouting, pointing in her direction. She ducked into the alley, the sudden shade a brief respite from the relentless sun. The alley reeked of manure and coal smoke. It was a narrow, claustrophobic space, but it was her only path away from the main street. She ran her breath, coming in ragged sobs. She was almost to the other end of the alley when a figure blocked her path. Her heart leaped into her throat. It wasn't one of Thorne's men. It was Dasan. He was leaning against the far wall, his body slumped in exhaustion. The front of his torso was now completely covered in blood. His face was ashen, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed to embers. He had somehow gotten out of the chapel and cut through the back to intercept her. She skidded to a halt, trapping herself between the warrior and the men who were surely pursuing her. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her adrenaline-fueled flight. Was he here to claim her after all? Had Thorne's monstrous bargain become a self-fulfilling prophecy? "They will be coming," he said, his voice a strained whisper. He pushed himself off the wall, staggering slightly. "Get away from me." Isabella breathed her back, pressing against the rough wall of the alley. Dasan held up his empty hands, a gesture of peace that seemed absurd given the circumstances. "I will not harm you." His eyes, filled with a weary pain, met hers. Thorne, he is alive. I could not finish it." He coughed, a racking, painful sound, and a fresh trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. "But they will hunt you now. He will not forgive your defiance." He was right. Thorne would be incandescent with rage. She had not only witnessed his humiliation, but had actively participated in it. There would be no corner of this territory where she would be safe from his wrath. "And they will hunt you," she stated, the reality of their shared predicament dawning on her. He gave a grim, faint nod. "They will." He looked past her down the alley towards the sounds of shouting. "They will search the town first. We must go, now." "Go where?" she cried, her voice laced with hysteria. "I have nowhere to go." "With me," he said simply. He took a faltering step towards her. "The mountains. It is the only place he will not follow." It was an insane proposition. To flee with a wounded Apache warrior, a man who had crashed her wedding seeking vengeance, a man hunted by the most powerful cattle baron in the region. It was a death sentence. But staying in redemption was also a death sentence, a slower, more degrading one. She looked into Dasan's eyes. He was a killer, a warrior, a savage in the eyes of her people. But he had also, in his own way, saved her. He had refused Thorne's despicable bargain. He had seen her as a person, not property. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Jed's voice echoed down the alley. "She went this way. Spread out." Isabella had a choice to make, a choice that had to be made in a heartbeat. The devil, she knew, or the wounded stranger who offered a desperate, uncertain freedom. She looked at the blood soaking his chest, at the profound exhaustion on his face. He was her only hope, and she, it seemed, was his. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper, a prayer on the wind. "I'll go." Dasan nodded, a flicker of relief in his tired eyes. He pointed towards the end of the alley. "My horse is hidden in the rocks beyond the edge of town. If we can reach it." He didn't need to finish. Isabella understood. If they could reach it. Together, the runaway bride and the wounded warrior slipped out of the alley's far end, melting into the shadows and scrub that bordered the town of Redemption. Two fugitives bound together by the blood and violence of a wedding day gone to hell. Their desperate flight for survival had just begun. The desert swallowed them whole. The moment they cleared the last ramshackle structure of Redemption, the vast, silent expanse of the Chihuahuan landscape became their sanctuary and their prison. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the heat rising from the baked earth shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon and promising false oases. Isabella's pristine white wedding dress, already torn and stained, was a beacon in the stark landscape. Dasan, moving with a pained, shuffling gait, immediately pointed to it. "The dress," he rasped, his breath catching in his throat. "They will see it from miles away." Without a word, Isabella began to rip at the fabric. The delicate lace and fine cotton, meant for a life of constrained elegance, tore easily in her desperate hands. She ripped away the bottom half of the skirt, freeing her legs. She tore at the sleeves, leaving her arms bare to the sun. The remaining fabric was a tattered off-white tunic that was far more practical for their flight. The act was one of liberation, each tear a symbolic severing from the life she was leaving behind. Dasan led them not in a straight line, but in a weaving, unpredictable path through arroyos and behind rocky outcrops, using the natural contours of the land for cover. His knowledge of the terrain was instinctual, profound. He was a part of this land, and it was clear that Thorn, for all his power and wealth, was merely a trespasser. But Dasan was fading fast. His face was pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, and a sheen of cold sweat covered his body, despite the blistering heat. The blood from the wound in his side had soaked through his buckskin leggings, leaving a dark, wet trail on the sand behind them. He stumbled more frequently, his strong frame racked with tremors. "We have to stop," Isabella said, her own voice hoarse from thirst and exertion. "You're bleeding too much. To stop is to die." He countered his voice, a low growl of determination. But a moment later his legs buckled and he collapsed to his knees, his head hanging low. Isabella rushed to his side. "Let me see," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. He didn't have the strength to refuse. He slumped against a sun-warmed boulder as she carefully peeled back the torn fabric of his shirt. The wound was worse than she had imagined. It was a deep, jagged puncture, likely from a rifle bayonet or a knife in the melee at the chapel. It was oozing blood sluggishly, the area around it already swollen and discolored. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. She was a merchant's daughter, taught needlepoint and etiquette, not medicine. But a memory surfaced, a lesson from her mother, a woman who had learned the remedies of the desert from the local Mexican and native women. "The desert provides," her mother used to say. "You just have to know where to look." "Stay here," she commanded Dasan, a newfound authority in her voice. "Don't move." She scanned the landscape, her eyes searching desperately. She remembered her mother pointing out the creosote bush, its small, waxy leaves known for their antiseptic properties. She found a cluster nearby, its pungent, resinous smell filling the air as she crushed the leaves between her fingers. She also found a broad, flat leaf from a prickly pear cactus, carefully burning off the spines in a small fire. She started with the flint and steel from a pouch on Dasan's belt. When she returned, Dasan was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. "This will hurt," she warned, her voice gentle. She first used a piece of her ripped dress, soaked with water from Dasan's own canteen, to clean the wound as best she could. He hissed in pain, but didn't pull away. Then she packed the crushed creosote leaves into the gash. Dasan's entire body went rigid, a low groan escaping his lips. Finally, she used the warm, moist pulp from the cactus pad as a poultice, placing it over the leaves and binding the entire dressing tightly with long strips of fabric torn from her ruined dress. It was a crude, desperate act of field medicine, but it was all she had. As she worked, she saw the other wounds, the gash on his face, the bruises darkening his ribs, the raw rope-like burns on his wrists. Someone had tied him up before he had made it to the chapel. He had escaped one torment only to walk into another. "Who did this to you?" she asked softly, her fingers securing the final knot on the bandage. His eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his gaze hazy with pain. "Thorn's men," he whispered. "They patrol the old trails. They found me, near the foothills. They were looking for you." He shook his head slightly. "Looking for anyone? They were hunting for sport." The words were quiet, but they carried a weight of horror that chilled Isabella to the bone. They hadn't found a warrior seeking vengeance. They had found a man, Tarza's brother, and had tortured him for their own amusement. Dasan's dramatic arrival at the chapel was not just an act of vengeance, but the culmination of a desperate, bloody escape. A fragile, unspoken alliance formed between them in the shadow of that boulder. They were no longer just a runaway bride and a wounded warrior. They were two survivors bound by a shared enemy and the harsh, indifferent wilderness. They rested for a precious hour as the sun began its slow descent towards the western horizon. Isabella watched over Dasan as he drifted into a feverish, restless sleep, his lips murmuring words in a language she didn't understand. She shared the last of their water, forcing small sips between his cracked lips. When he awoke, the fire in his eyes had returned, though it was still weak. "We must go," he said, his voice stronger than before. "The horse." He leaned on her heavily as he rose to his feet. The strange intimacy of their situation was not lost on Isabella. Just hours ago, she had been preparing to bind herself to a man she despised. Now she was the sole support for a man who was her people's sworn enemy, yet who had shown her more honor than any man she knew. They found the horse at dusk, a magnificent paint pony, hidden cleverly in a small canyon, its reins tied to a gnarled mesquite tree. The sight of the animal, strong and patient, was a testament to Dasan's foresight. Getting him onto the horse was an ordeal. By the time he was settled in the saddle, slumped forward and clinging to the mane, he was slick with fresh sweat, and a small dark spot had begun to stain the white bandage at his side. "I can't," he began, his voice failing him. "I will lead," Isabella said, taking the reins. There was no question, no hesitation. Their roles had reversed. He was no longer the fierce warrior leading her to safety. She was the one guiding him, her determination, a shield against his weakness. With her hand firmly on the reins, Isabella Montoya, the girl who was supposed to be a cattle baron's wife, led the wounded Apache warrior and his paint pony into the deepening twilight, heading for the dark, jagged peaks of the mountains that loomed on the horizon. A place of uncertain sanctuary and the next stage of their impossible journey. The ascent into the Dragoon Mountains was a journey into another world. The oppressive heat of the desert floor gave way to the cool, pine-scented air of the high country. The landscape transformed from sparse scrub and cactus to a rugged terrain of granite domes, hidden canyons, and thick forests of oak and pine. For Isabella, who had spent her life on the flat plains, it was like stepping onto another planet. Beautiful, intimidating, and wild. Dasan, delirious with fever, was a dead weight in the saddle. Isabella walked beside the paint pony, one hand on the reins, the other often reaching up to steady him. During his brief moments of lucidity, he would give her whispered directions, guiding her along barely perceptible trails that snaked through the treacherous landscape. "Follow the raven's shadow," he'd murmur, or "listen for the water that speaks." She learned to read the signs of the wilderness through his eyes, to see the subtle language of the land that had been invisible to her before. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in sieves or dense thickets. The mountains that had seemed a monolithic barrier from the desert floor were up close a labyrinth of secret places. It was Dasan's home. He was known here. His spirit, even in his wounded state, seemed to draw strength from the ancient rocks and whispering pines. His fever raged for 2 days. Isabella tended to him with a fierce maternal devotion. She found a spring of clear, cold water and bathed his hot skin. She changed the poultice on his wound, using her newfound knowledge of desert plants to find yarrow, to staunch the bleeding, and juniper berries to make a cleansing tea. She hunted clumsily at first, using a simple snare Dasan taught her to make in a moment of clarity. She caught 2 rabbits, skinning and cooking them over a small, smokeless fire, the taste of the meat a welcome relief from their hunger. During the long hours of his delirium, he spoke. He spoke of his brother Taza, not as the thief Thorn had branded him, but as a laughing, vibrant young man who could track a deer for days and knew the songs of every bird. He spoke of their childhood in these very mountains of raids and hunts, of traditions and ceremonies that were as old as the stones around them. And he spoke a name that sent a chill down Isabella's spine. Not a man's name, but a woman's. Anawa. He would murmur, his voice thick with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. Anawa. Forgive me. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Dasan awoke at dawn, his eyes clear for the first time since the chapel. He was weak, emaciated, but the fire was back. He looked at Isabella, who had fallen asleep, sitting against a rock near him, her hand still resting near his forehead. He saw the smudges of dirt on her face, the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the determined set of her jaw even in sleep. He saw the strips of her wedding dress that now bound his wound. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Isabella stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "You would have done the same," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. A new dynamic settled between them in the clear mountain air. The frantic desperation of their escape was replaced by a quiet, shared existence. They were no longer just allies of convenience, but companions. He taught her the Apache names for the plants and animals, how to find north by the stars, how to move silently through the forest. She in turn told him of her life in redemption of her mother, who had loved the desert, and of her father whose weakness had almost condemned her to a living hell. She spoke of books and music, of a world so different from his that it might as well have been the moon. They never spoke of the future. The present was too precarious. They knew Thorn would not give up. His pride had been wounded as deeply as his hand, and his rage would be a relentless burning fire. One evening, as they shared the last of the rabbit meat, Isabella gathered her courage. "Dasan," she began. "Who is Anawa?" The name fell into the quiet air between them. Dasan stiffened, the warmth leaving his face. He stared into the fire, his expression closing off. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "She was to be my wife," he said, finally, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Isabella's heart gave a strange, unexpected lurch. "What happened? She is gone." He said the words sharp as flint. He picked up a stick and began to draw patterns in the dirt, his jaw tight. 2 winters ago, a sickness came to our camp. It took many. The young, the old. It took her. He looked up at Isabella, and for the first time she saw a vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored her own. "Our marriage was arranged like yours, a joining of 2 families. I did not love her, not in the way your people speak of, but there was respect, a bond. Her family still blames me. Blames you for a sickness. They say I was not strong enough to protect her," he said, his voice bitter. "That my spirit was weak. That is why, when Taza was murdered, I had to answer the blood claim, to prove my strength, to restore my honor, not just for my brother, but for myself." Isabella finally understood the depths of the warrior who sat before her. His quest for vengeance was not just about retribution for his brother's death. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim his own identity, to silence the ghosts of his past. He was as much a prisoner of his culture's expectations as she had been of hers. "Her brother," Dasan continued, his voice barely a whisper, "is a warrior named Kael. He believes I am cursed. He believes I bring misfortune to those I am bound to." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but terrifyingly clear. Dasan believed it too. He had lost Anawa. He had failed to save Taza, and now he had brought Isabella into his world of violence and flight. He saw himself as a harbinger of doom. Before Isabella could respond, the sharp crack of a twig breaking in the darkness beyond their small fire made them both freeze. Dasan was on his feet in an instant, a knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. He moved in front of Isabella, shielding her with his body, his eyes scanning the impenetrable blackness of the surrounding forest. The silence that followed was absolute. The chirping of the crickets had ceased. The whispering of the wind in the pines seemed to hold its breath. They were not alone in the mountains anymore. A voice called out from the darkness, low and menacing, a voice that dripped with malice and cold fury. It was a voice Isabella recognized with a surge of pure terror. "I know you're in there, you filthy savage, and I know you have my property." It was Bartholomew Thorn. He had followed them, and he had brought the devil with him. The devil's voice sliced through the sacred silence of the mountains. "I know you're in there, you filthy savage." The voice belonged to Bartholomew Thorn, and it dripped with a cold personal fury. "And I know you have my property." The menacing click of multiple rifle hammers being cocked echoed through the canyon. They were surrounded. Isabella's blood ran cold. He hadn't just sent men. He had come himself, driven by a pride that was more wounded than his hand. "Send out the girl," Thorn commanded, his voice a low growl. "And I'll give you a quick death. Fight, and we'll kill you slow. After that, the girl will wish she were dead too." Dasan knew they were trapped. He was still weak, his bow no match for their rifles. A direct fight was suicide. He glanced back at Isabella, saw the terror in her eyes, and felt the ghosts of his past failures rise within him. He would not fail again. He would not let Thorn have her. "There is a way," he whispered urgently, his back still to her as he scanned the darkness. "A fissure at the back of this cave. It leads up to a higher ledge. You must go. Now." "No," Isabella breathed, her voice shaking. "I won't leave you." "You must," he insisted, turning to face her. His eyes, illuminated by the dying embers of their fire, blazed with desperation. "I will hold them here. Give you time. Take the pony and ride north. Find a new life." "They will kill you," she sobbed, tears welling in her eyes. A bullet suddenly splintered the rock just above the cave entrance, showering them with stone fragments. "Go!" Dasan commanded, his voice a harsh roar that broke through her fear. He grabbed his bow, knocking an arrow, as he moved to the mouth of the cave. "Now, Isabella." Torn. She scrambled towards the dark, narrow crack in the rock. As she squeezed into the opening, she looked back at Dasan, a lone warrior preparing to face an impossible foe. Their eyes met one last time, a silent goodbye filled with regret and a fierce, protective spirit. Suddenly, a different voice cried out from the darkness. "Run! It's a trap!" It was Caleb, the young ranch hand. His voice filled with panic. Before anyone could react, the night erupted. It was not a gunshot, but a high, ululating war cry that seemed to come from all directions at once. From the rocks above and the trees below, silent, ghostly figures emerged, their faces painted for war. Apache warriors. At least a dozen of them, armed and moving with a deadly coordinated grace. Thorn's posse was thrown into chaos. "Ambush!" a man screamed, firing his rifle blindly before an arrow silenced him. The swift, brutal assault was a symphony of death. Gunshots, war cries, and the screams of dying men echoed through the mountains as Thorn's men were cut down in a deadly crossfire. Isabella, frozen in the fissure, watched in stunned horror. This wasn't Dasan's doing. A tall warrior with a stern, unforgiving face landed silently beside Dasan. "Brother," the warrior said, his voice grim, "you lead our enemies to our sacred places." It was Kael, Anawa's brother. This was no rescue. "We followed your trail of blood." Kael said, his eyes cold. "We saw you with her." He gestured toward Isabella. "Another woman you will lead to her death." In a desperate panic, Thorn saw Isabella silhouetted in the cave. With a roar of fury, he raised his rifle. "If I can't have you, no one will." But Caleb. The young ranch hand did the unthinkable. He lunged at Thorn, shoving the rifle barrel upwards. "No. She's innocent." Thorn, enraged, clubbed him with the rifle butt, but the precious second had been bought. An arrow from Kael's bow whistled through the air, sinking deep into Thorn's shoulder. He shrieked, dropping his rifle as he was spun around. The fight was over. Kael and his warriors stepped from the shadows, their victory absolute. Kael walked to Dasan, his expression unreadable. "You have brought war to our homes. For this you must answer to the elders." He then turned his cold, hard eyes to the fissure, where Isabella hid his voice, sealing her fate with a terrifying new pronouncement. "And the white woman. She is the cause of this. She will be our prize, a payment for the blood spilled here tonight." The first light of dawn painted the granite peaks in hues of rose, a beautiful, indifferent witness to the carnage. Thorn, bound and defeated, glared with impotent fury as his dead men lay still in the canyon. At the center of the Apache warriors stood Kyle, his face a mask of cold victory. Isabella was led from the cave. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she met Kyle's gaze with a defiance that mirrored his own. "This was not her doing," Dasan said, stepping between them. "The fight was with Thorn." "She is the reason he was here," Kyle retorted, his voice like stone. "You brought this plague upon us, just as you brought sickness to my sister Anawa." The accusation, spoken so bluntly, hung in the air. Before Dasan could reply, an elder with silver-white hair and the weight of wisdom in his eyes stepped forward. His name was Geronimo. His gaze swept over the scene, landing first on the captive cattle baron. "You are a man of greed and no honor," Geronimo said, his voice quiet but absolute. "The mountain does not suffer your kind." At his nod, 2 warriors dragged the snarling Thorn into the trees. His fate was sealed. The elder then looked at Caleb, the young ranch hand. "You chose honor over cruelty. Walk away from this life of violence. Do not return." Stunned, Caleb scrambled to his feet and began the long journey back to the plains. Finally, Geronimo turned to Isabella. "The white woman fought with the heart of a warrior. She is not a prize. You are free to go," he declared. "We will give you a horse and provisions for the journey north." Freedom. It was hers. Isabella looked at Dasan, who gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Go. Be free." But leaving him to face the council's judgment, to be haunted by the ghost of Kyle's blame, felt like another kind of prison. She had been running her whole life. She was tired of running. "I will stay," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound certainty that stunned the warriors into silence. She turned to face the elder. "I will speak for him at the council. I will tell them of his honor, of how he refused a coward's bargain and fought to save me. I owe him my life, and I will not abandon him." Then she looked at Dasan, her gaze cutting through his defenses. "You think you are cursed," she said softly, for his ears only. "But you saved me. My life truly began the day you crashed my wedding. Whatever comes next, we will face it together." Dasan stared at her, the walls around his heart crumbling. In her eyes he saw not failure or a curse, but unwavering loyalty. He saw a partner. Kyle watched them, his own certainty shaken. He saw the bond between them forged not by duty, but by fire and respect, and the curse that had haunted his family for 2 winters finally began to lift. The old elder Geronimo smiled, a deep and knowing expression. The mountain had made its judgment. The runaway bride and the wounded warrior, 2 souls from different worlds, had found something profound. Their future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was a future they would choose for themselves together. Their path would be a new trail forged not in blood, but in a love as wild and resilient as the land that had given it birth. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to the untamed heart of the Wild West. The story of Isabella and Dasan is a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, courage, honor, and love can bloom in the most unexpected ways. Theirs was a trial by fire, a clash of worlds that forged an unbreakable bond. If their story of survival and defiance moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to share this epic tale with others who love stories of drama, grit, and the enduring power of the human spirit. And most importantly, if you want more gripping stories from the annals of history and the wild frontiers, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next adventure we have in store. Until next time, stay brave, stay curious, and keep the stories alive.